Alright, tonight I just want to talk. This isn't a rant, it's not a hit piece, it's not this group versus that group. It's something I've been noticing for a long time. And judging by the comments, a lot of you have been feeling it too. Something is fundamentally off, and it goes deeper than any single issue. People keep arguing about symptoms, cost of living, dating, nightlife dying, work culture, welfare, generational conflict. But those are all branches. They are not the root. The root is that the social contract is broken. And when I say social contract, I don't mean some academic theory. I mean the unspoken agreement that made life feel coherent. The deal nobody signed, but everybody understood. The deal was simple. You show up, you try. You play by the rules, you contribute. You don't deliberately sabotage yourself. And in return, you get a life that makes sense. Not luxury, not fame, not a mansion, just stability, dignity, a future you can roughly plan. That deal used to exist. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough that people believed in it. That belief is gone. And what replaces belief isn't rebellion, it's disengagement. People keep asking why everyone feels tired, unmotivated, bitter, or numb. Why people don't go out as much. Why dating feels dead. Why nobody wants to go the extra mile at work. Why everyone seems on edge, but also checked out at the same time. This is why. Because effort stopped guaranteeing safety. Let's talk about effort for a second, because this is where a lot of conversations go wrong. Effort still matters. Discipline still matters. Personal responsibility still matters. None of that disappeared. What disappeared is the outcome. In the past, effort didn't guarantee success, but it usually guaranteed stability. If you worked full time, you could afford somewhere to live. If you stayed employed, you weren't constantly one step away from panic. If you were average and consistent, you could still build a decent life. That baseline is gone. Now you can do everything right and still feel like you are barely hanging on. And that changes how people behave at a deep psychological level. When effort feels disconnected from outcome, motivation doesn't vanish overnight. What vanishes first is trust. You stop trusting advice. You stop trusting institutions. You stop trusting narratives. You stop trusting that tomorrow will be better just because you tried harder today. And once that trust goes, people adapt in ways that look antisocial, lazy, or cynical from the outside, but make perfect sense from the inside. This is why the just work harder advice hits differently now. Not because it's wrong in principle, but because it's incomplete. It assumes the system on the other end is stable and fair enough to reward that effort. For a lot of people, it isn't. And when people hear that advice from someone who already made it, a celebrity, an influencer, a successful entrepreneur, it doesn't motivate them. It reminds them of the gap between those who crossed the bridge before it collapsed and those standing on the wrong side being told to hurry up. That doesn't create inspiration. It creates quiet resentment. Not loud resentment, not screaming on Twitter resentment. The quieter kind. The kind where people stop caring. This is why nightlife is dying. And I want to be very clear about this because people keep missing the point. Nightlife didn't die because people became boring. It died because chaos stopped feeling like a reward. When life feels unstable, you don't want to spend money to feel more unstable. You don't want to pay to be overstimulated, overcharged, socially judged, and physically exhausted. You don't want to scream over music to prove you are having fun. So people retreat. Smaller gatherings, earlier nights, fewer outings, or none at all. That's not depression, that's adaptation. Same thing with dating. Dating culture keeps selling abundance, endless options. Confidence fixes everything. Meanwhile, real people experience ghosting, burnout, rejection, and emotional fatigue. When the story says opportunity is everywhere, but lived experience says connection is rare, people don't lose faith in dating, they lose faith in the story. And when people stop believing the story, they stop participating fully. You see the same pattern at work. People talk about quiet quitting like it's some moral failure, like people just decided to stop caring for no reason. That's not what happened. What happened is loyalty stopped being reciprocated. Going above and beyond stopped meaning protection. Mistakes became fatal. Jobs became conditional. Security became temporary. So people adjusted. They did what the system taught them to do, protect themselves. They stopped over-investing emotionally in structures that wouldn't protect them in return. From the outside, that looks like laziness. From the inside, it feels like self-preservation. And this is where generational tension comes in, because a lot of older attitudes are based on a world where the social contract was actually working. Not perfectly, but enough to justify believing in it. So when younger people push back, question work culture, or demand safety nets, it gets framed as entitlement. But what they are actually reacting to is instability. They are not asking for shortcuts. They are asking for the deal to make sense again. And when that gets dismissed, something breaks internally. You stop trusting people who tell you everything is fine when it clearly isn't. You stop respecting narratives that don't match reality. You stop caring about institutions that feel indifferent to your survival. That's when people start checking out. Not dramatically, quietly. They still show up physically, they still work, they still pay bills, but emotionally, they are gone. You can hear it in how people talk now. No long-term plans, no confidence in the future. Everything is provisional. Everything is we will see. That's not because people lack ambition. It's because ambition without stability feels reckless. And this is where welfare conversations get ugly. Because welfare exposes the lie at the center of the broken contract. It forces the question, what happens when people do what they are supposed to do and still fall through the cracks? Instead of answering that honestly, society often turns on the people at the bottom, because blaming individuals preserves the illusion that the system is fair. Calling someone lazy is comforting. It means the rules still work. It means suffering is deserved. It means your own sacrifices still meant something. That's where a lot of bitterness comes from. Not cruelty, fear. Fear that maybe effort wasn't the only factor. Maybe timing mattered. Maybe access mattered. Maybe help mattered. And that's uncomfortable. You see the double standard everywhere. When someone successful opts out, it's self-care. When someone struggling does the same thing, it's failure. Same behavior, different judgment. That teaches people something very clearly. Rest is only acceptable once you are no longer vulnerable. So people don't rest. They burn out quietly. And then we act shocked when mental health issues explode, when truth collapses, when people withdraw socially. Even politics reflects this. Everyone is angry, Nobody believes anything will change. Arguments everywhere. Faith nowhere. And that's what a broken social contract looks like. Loud frustration on the surface, quiet resignation underneath. And I want to stress this. This isn't about saying everything is doomed. It's about naming reality honestly. Because you cannot rebuild trust by pretending nothing changed. The social contract promised stability in exchange for participation. Participation is demanded, stability is not guaranteed. That's the core issue. And once people realize that, belief doesn't come back easily. You can't shame people into caring. You can't motivate them with slogans that don't match reality. You can't guilt them into loyalty. Because people aren't stupid. They know when they are being asked to give more than they are getting. So what happens next? What we are seeing now isn't collapse. It's withdrawal. People shrink in their worlds, choosing peace over status, control over chaos, fewer connections, fewer risks, fewer illusions. That scares institutions more than anger ever could. Angry people still believe enough to fight. Disengaged people just stop showing up emotionally. That's where we are. So if you felt tired in a way rest doesn't fix, if you've stepped back from things that used to feel meaningful, if you felt like you were doing everything right but still falling behind, you are not broken. You are responding rationally to a system that quietly changed the rules. And the first step to fixing that isn't blaming each other. It's admitting the contract is broken. I want to hear from you. Drop it in the chat. Where did you feel it break? Work? Dating? Money? Family expectations? Social life? Because I don't think people are failing the system. I think the system stopped holding up to its end of the deal. Quick heads up before we keep going. I've got a Facebook page where I post a lot more of this stuff. It's not a business page, it's not monetized, and it's not a brand. It's a non-profit page. I run it purely because I think these conversations actually matter. No sponsors, no ads, no fake positivity, just raw clips, thoughts, arguments, humour, and uncomfortable topics people avoid. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not pushing an agenda. It's just a place for people who still like thinking, questioning, disagreeing, and laughing without everything being cleaned up for algorithms. If you agree with me, disagree with me, or just want somewhere that isn't filtered to death, the link's there. You'll usually see stuff there before it ever hits YouTube. Alright, back to the video. They don't hate intelligence. That's the comfortable lie. What they hate is what intelligence exposes. Because real intelligence isn't charming. It doesn't comfort, it doesn't reassure, it doesn't exist to make people feel good about themselves. It exists to notice, and noticing is violent to illusion. The intellectual is not hated because they are superior. They are hated because they refuse to pretend. They refuse to pretend that contradictions are harmony. They refuse to pretend that consciousness is truth. They refuse to pretend that emotion is evidence. And they refuse to pretend that belonging is wisdom. And when one person refuses to pretend, everyone else suddenly becomes aware that they are pretending. That awareness hurts. It creates shame. And shame never attacks itself. It looks for a target. So it attacks the intellectual. Not through debate, not through reason, but through character assassination. Through tone policing, through social isolation, through labels, through dismissal, through mockery, through moral inversion. You are arrogant. You are cold. You are negative. You are overthinking. You are not fun. Not because the intellectual is wrong, but because they are inconvenient. They make reality heavier, and people prefer light lies to heavy truth. The intellectual doesn't ruin conversations. They reveal what conversations are built on. They reveal that most dialogue is not about understanding, it's about alignment. Not about truth, but about emotional loyalty. People don't want to know if they are wrong. They want to know if they are supported. So the intellectual becomes a traitor by default, because they are loyal to coherence, not comfort. Loyal to questions, not identities. Loyal to clarity, not tribes. And loyalty to clarity is unforgivable in a world that survives on narrative obedience. The intellectual also reminds people of something they've abandoned: their curiosity, their doubt, their capacity to think without permission. The intellectual represents the version of themselves they did not become. And humans hate mirrors more than enemies. That's why intellectuals are attacked personally instead of intellectually. Their posture is criticized, their tone is criticized, their social skills are criticized, their delivery is criticized. Anything except their content. Because attacking content requires understanding it, and understanding it risks accepting it. So society doesn't silence intellectuals with violence. It silences them with exclusion. They are tolerated only when they simplify. They are welcomed only when they entertain. They are celebrated only when they agree. Death is permitted only when it is decorative. But the moment intelligence becomes disruptive, it becomes threatening. The intellectual eventually realizes they are not misunderstood. They are understood enough to be avoided, because proximity to awareness forces self-examination. And self-examination is exhausting when your identity is built on shortcuts. So people rewrite the intellectual into something easier to hate. They turn intelligence into arrogance. They turn precision into cruelty. They turn depth into elitism. Because if intelligence is allowed to be accurate and good at the same time, mediocrity loses its protection. The intellectual begins to withdraw, not out of superiority, out of sadness. Because they see humans defending the very illusions that limit them. They see people protecting cages as if they were homes. They see emotional attachment to beliefs that were never chosen, only inherited. And there is nothing more tragic than watching someone protect what confines them. The intellectual carries awareness without relief. They see patterns, they see repetition, they see inevitability. They watch revolutions become branding. They watch suffering become content. They watch empathy become performance. And they watch morality become strategy. And slowly, something changes inside them. They drift towards nihilism, not as rebellion, as recognition. Nihilism doesn't begin with despair. It begins with clarity. It begins when you realize that meaning is assigned, not discovered. That morality shifts with convenience. That history is curated. That identity is constructed. That truth is filtered. That justice is selective. The intellectual doesn't decide nothing matters. They realize nothing matters automatically. And that distinction changes everything. Nihilism is not apathy, it is intellectual grief. It is what remains when illusions fall away. It is the quiet understanding that the universe does not care if you are kind or honest or awake, that existence continues whether you understand it or not. And for the first time, meaning becomes your responsibility. Not destinies, not God's, not society's, not history's, yours. And responsibility without illusion is heavy. So most people reject nihilism, not because it is false, but because it removes their emotional scaffolding. The intellectual does not reject it. They learn to live inside it, and that makes them even more dangerous. Because a nihilistic intellectual cannot be controlled by hope, fear, promise, or destiny. They no longer believe history is progressing towards justice. They no longer believe humanity is morally ascending. They no longer believe suffering has cosmic purpose. They believe only in awareness, choice, and consequence. They don't need meaning handed to them. They can exist without narrative, and a person who can exist without narrative cannot be owned. Nihilism doesn't make the intellectual cruel, it makes them precise. It strips away emotional fantasy, it dissolves sacred illusions, it turns morality from theatre into responsibility. But it also carries a cost, because love becomes riskier when you know it is temporary. Joy becomes softer when you know it is fragile. Hope becomes quieter when you know it is optional. And belief becomes cautious when you know it is constructed. The intellectual does not lose emotion. They lose emotional innocence. They can still love, but they love knowing it may end. They can still hope, but they hope without guarantees. They can still care, but they care without cosmic reassurance. And that makes their care more real. Not louder, but deeper. The nihilistic intellectual does not believe life is pointless. They believe life has no automatic point. And so they ask a question most people cannot bear. What am I willing to care about despite its meaninglessness? That question has no comfort, only responsibility, only freedom. And freedom terrifies people more than chains. So society returns to its stories, its heroes, its villains, its emotion, its moral theatre, and it hates the intellectual even more now, because the intellectual no longer reacts correctly. They don't cheer on cue, they don't outrage on schedule, they don't mourn, they don't celebrate without permission. They stand slightly apart from the performance. Not cold, not heartless, just aware. And awareness ruins theatre. The intellectual becomes lonely, not because they reject people, but because people reject the discomfort they represent. They begin to wonder if awareness is a defect, if clarity is a curse, if ignorance is peace. They envy ease. They envy certainty. They envy belonging. But they cannot return. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you question, you cannot worship. Once you understand patterns, you cannot believe in randomness the same way. Once you know, you cannot pretend. So the intellectual walks alone, not as a hero, not as a martyr, just as a witness, to a world that prefers comfort over clarity, to a society that fears responsibility more than ignorance, to a humanity that loves intellectuals only after they are dead, when they can no longer interrupt, when they can no longer correct, when they can no longer expose. Only then are they quoted, romanticized, turned into symbols instead of threats. Because living thinkers still argue back, still refuse to behave, still ask why. And why is the most dangerous word in any system built on obedience. So when you ask why intellectuals are hated, it's not because they are smarter, it's because they are awake. And awakening is contagious. And nothing frightens a comfortable world more than a mind that no longer needs permission to think. The intellectual is not hated because they destroy meaning. They are hated because they demand that meaning survive honesty. They are not hated because they are cold. They are hated because they are clear. They are not hated because they are superior. They are hated because they are free. And freedom, in a world built on stories, is the most unforgivable crime. So the intellectual does not ask to be loved. They no longer ask to belong. They only remain honest. And in that honesty, they lose illusions, they lose approval, they lose comfort. But they gain something rare: silence. Not the absence of sound, the absence of lies. And in that silence, they finally meet themselves. Not as a role, not as a label, not as a story, but as a conscious witness inside an indifferent universe. And for the first time, nothing is pretending. And somehow, that is enough. Thanks for listening. Normies, welcome to the game. I keep seeing people online suddenly discovering politics. No history, no nuance, no memory, just outrage. They talk about how bad Finns have gotten, like the world broke the moment they noticed it. But Finns didn't start getting bad when you arrived. They were already bad while you were laughing at the people talking about it. You ignored the laws changing. You ignored the policies shaping the future. You ignored the wars, the poverty, the cost of living. Not because you didn't see them, but because they didn't emotionally inconvenience you yet. And when someone tried to talk about it, you mocked them, called them paranoid, dramatic, obsessed. Now the consequences are visible. Now it affects you. Now suddenly it's a crisis. That's not awareness, that's selective outrage. You don't care about causes, you care about symptoms. You don't ask what led here, you just want it fixed. And the moment the immediate danger fades, you'll disappear again. Back to individualism, back to distraction, back to pretending none of it exists. Until the next shock wakes you up. And when it does, you'll act like it all started yesterday. Again, not the tutorial, not the menu screen, not the highlight reel you saw on TikTok. The actual game. Because I keep seeing people arrive late, angry, confused, and convinced the match just started. Suddenly, everyone's political. Suddenly, everyone has opinions. Suddenly, everyone knows who ruined everything. And somehow, it's never themselves. They talk about how bad things have gotten, how broken everything is, how corrupt, unfair, rigged, dangerous, and unstable the world feels. And I always wonder, where were you when it was being built like this? Where were you when the laws changed quietly? When the policies slid through while nobody was watching? When the costs climbed and the wages didn't? When the systems rewrote themselves in boardrooms instead of ballots? You were busy scrolling, busy laughing, busy calling people dramatic, busy saying, it doesn't affect me. You didn't oppose it, you didn't defend it, you didn't even understand it, you just ignored it. And now you are shocked. You are shocked that the house is on fire when you slept through the smoke alarm. That's not awareness, that's selective outrage. You didn't arrive because you care about truth. You arrived because the consequences finally reached your front door. And that's the pattern. Humans don't wake up when something is wrong. They wake up when something is uncomfortable. You didn't care when it was theoretical. You cared when it became personal. And now you want answers. Fast answers, simple answers, comfortable answers. You want villains, you want heroes, you want slogans. You want something you can share, like, and forget. You don't want complexity, because complexity doesn't give dopamine. Outrage does. So you join the noise. You repeat what feels right. You adopt the tone of whichever tribe you landed in. Not because it's true, but because it feels safe. And safety is the currency now. You don't ask what led here. You ask, who do I blame? You don't ask what systems failed. You ask, what should I hate? Who should I hate? You don't ask, how did we allow this? You ask, who should fix it for me? And when someone says, this didn't start yesterday, you roll your eyes. Because memory is inconvenient. History ruins outrage. Context ruins certainty. And certainty is the drug you want to feel right, not responsible. That's why every crisis feels new. That's why every collapse feels sudden. That's why every mistake feels like it came out of nowhere. Because you weren't paying attention when it was forming. You only notice storms when the rain hits you. And here's the uncomfortable part. You didn't just ignore the warning signs. You mocked them. You called people paranoid, obsessed, bitter, negative, extreme. You told them to touch grass. You told them to stop overthinking. You told them to stop being dramatic. And now you are repeating their arguments like they were always obvious. That's not growth. That's theft. You didn't change. You just arrived. And you arrived with entitlement. Because you don't want to build solutions. You want refunds. You want stability without sacrifice. Order without discipline. Justice without responsibility. You want the game patched without learning how it works. You want peace without memory. You want insults without reflection. And the worst part, you think your arrival makes you important. You think the moment you notice the problem is when it officially becomes real. Like history was buffering until your consciousness loaded. But the world doesn't wait for your awareness. It moves whether you watch it or not. And while you were asleep, choices were made. While you were distracted, structures were set. While you were entertained, futures were decided. Not by villains in cloaks, but by systems that survive on apathy. Because apathy is the most powerful political force on earth. Not evil, not hatred, not even corruption. Apathy. The quiet decision to not care until you are forced to. And now you are forced to. So you scream. You flood timelines. You demand action. But you don't demand understanding. And without understanding, every solution you support becomes another future problem someone else will wake up to. That's the cycle. Outrage. Temporary pressure. Cosmetic change. Return to comfort. Then repeat. You don't stay when the conversation gets boring. You don't stay when it gets technical. You don't stay when it stops feeling emotional. You leave when it requires effort. Because you didn't come to participate. You came to feel. And feeling has replaced thinking. Now everything is identity. Every issue becomes a personality. Every position becomes a tribe. Every disagreement becomes betrayal. You don't defend ideas, You defend belonging. And belonging doesn't care about truth. It cares about loyalty. That's why nuance feels like treason now. Because nuance doesn't protect groups. It threatens them. And you don't want truth. You want confirmation. You want anger validated. You want your fear justified. You want your side declared righteous. And you want it quickly. You want reality simplified into content. But reality doesn't simplify. It rots when ignored. And when it finally collapses, everyone acts surprised. You call it sudden. You call it shocking. You call it unbelievable. But it wasn't sudden. It was patient. It waited for you to care. And now that you do, you still don't want responsibility. You want someone else to fix it. You want leaders to save you. You want movements to carry you. You want trends to guide you. You don't want to change habits. You don't want to question comfort. You don't want to admit you benefited from what you now condemn. Because admitting that would mean you are not innocent. And innocence is sacred now. Everyone wants to be a victim. Nobody wants to be a participant. But participation doesn't end when you stop paying attention. Silence is a vote. Distraction is a choice. Comfort is a position. You didn't stand outside the system. You lived inside it. You enjoyed it. You defended it when it served you. And now that it doesn't, you call it broken. Not because it changed, but because you did. And that's the part nobody wants to admit. The system didn't betray you. It simply stopped rewarding you. So now you are awake. Welcome. But don't confuse waking up with understanding. Don't confuse anger with insight. Don't confuse posting with participation. And don't confuse arrival with authority. Because you didn't enter the game to fix it. You entered it because consequences finally reached you. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. Most people don't change the world. They react to it. They complain about it. They moralize it. They meme it. Then they forget it. Until it hurts again. And then they return louder, angrier, and just as unprepared. So yes, normies, welcome to the game. But understand something before you speak like you own it. Some of us never logged out. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next video.